Hello, I am Gamer Vince, and you can tell I'm serious about gaming by the headphones. So you want to play Dungeons and Dragons 3.5 Pathfinder, but you're not entirely sure what that all means. So that's what this video is going to be about. Is I'm going to be briefly talking about sort of what is Dungeons and Dragons, what makes it sort of a unique role-playing game, what is it all about. So let's first talk about versions. So when you hear about Dungeons and Dragons 3.5, that is talking about the version of Dungeons and Dragons that they're playing. Essentially what's happened is that, there was an original Dungeons and Dragons, then after that came a D&D, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which I believe is version 2, like Dungeons and Dragons 2.0. So you've got like the first version of Dungeons and Dragons, which was changed and improved upon to make the second version of Dungeons and Dragons, which was changed and improved upon to make the third version of Dungeons and Dragons. And the difference between each one of these can be quite stark. So if you're playing first edition Dungeons and Dragons, that's going to be pretty different from second edition, pretty different from third edition. So these versions are kind of very different from each other. Third edition Dungeons and Dragons was a very popular edition, I would imagine. In my circle of friends, it's popular. I don't know if worldwide it's the most popular, but I think it's pretty popular. So third edition was very popular, and they improved on it without changing the system too much. Just little kind of tweaks to it, which resulted in 3.5. Notice that it's not an entirely new version, it's just an update of the existing. So we ended up with 3.5. And this was a very popular system for a very long time. Then 4th edition came out, and there's mixed reviews on 4th edition. I've played it myself, and I think there's a time and place for that. I think it is very different from 3.5 D&D, but that was the idea. And 4th edition, didn't tickle the fancy of a lot of the people that liked 3.5 Dungeons and Dragons, which enter Pathfinder. Pathfinder is basically, a lot of people call it Dungeons and Dragons 3.75. It essentially took 3.5 Dungeons and Dragons and tweaked it, improved it, or changed it in ways that they thought was beneficial to the game, resulting in a sort of, weird version of Dungeons and Dragons. That's not actually Dungeons and Dragons, it's Pathfinder. It's not the same people. Not the same people made it. Though, of course, there are arguments that 4th edition was made by the same people. But I'm not here to talk about that. I'm just going to give you sort of like a broad overview. So 4th edition exists, and 5th edition is now out as well. 5th edition, they've just released the core books. At the making of this video, there aren't that many books out there for 5th edition yet. They're just sort of the core books, but I know that they've got more books in the works, and it won't take long before there's lots of books available for that as well. So first of all, why am I doing a video on Pathfinder and 3.5 D&D if other, more recent versions of D&D exist? And the answer is twofold. There's two reasons why I do that. One, I just like the system. 4th edition didn't do it for me, and a lot of sort of, I don't want to say hardcore gamers, but gamers who game a lot tended to not like 4th edition that much. 4th edition sort of modularized a lot. Is that a word? I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, but they made it modular. They have kind of like these like once a day abilities and once an encounter abilities, and all the characters work in very similar ways, which made it very easy for, say, a fighter, somebody who's been playing a fighter for a long time, to go in and play a wizard. It made it very newbie friendly. And I don't mean noob, N-O-O-B, I mean newbie friendly, N-E-W-B-I-E, yes. So it made it very beginner friendly. And it's not a bad place to start. If you've never played D&D before, I think 4th edition is actually a fine game. Now we're in 5th edition, and it remains to be seen, to me, how good of a system it is. But after having played it a couple of times, I think it took sort of a lot of the things that were good about 4th edition and kept some of the good stuff in 3.5. So it's harking back to both those traditions. But I'm still playing 3.5 D&D, and that's because I love everything about it. There's a lot of material for it. And that brings me to the second reason. Like I said, the first reason is just I like the system. I think it works pretty well, and these other systems that came after it, I don't think captured what I wanted out of the game. I really like a crunchy, number-heavy game, and 3.5 kind of delivers that. It's number heavy because it gives you so many options. There's a lot to, you can do a lot with the system that you may not necessarily get in 4th edition, and 5th edition plays around with it a little bit more. So that's reason number one, I just like the system. Reason number two is the sheer quantity of stuff for 3.5 D&D. 3.5 D&D just has a ludicrous amount of books produced for it, and there is, in order to play the game, you can do it just fine with essentially just one book, the player's handbook. That's really the only thing you absolutely need. If you have the player's handbook, you're good to go. You can play the game essentially. It would help to have, say, a monster manual for a variety of enemies, and the Dungeon Master's Guide if you want to introduce things like diseases and poisons and a lot of items and things like that. But it's essentially 3 books that if you want access to pretty much everything, all the rules that the game has to offer, 3 books will do you just fine. But then there's all these other books that just give you so many more options. 3.5 D&D has a huge library of books that you're just not going to get in the other versions of Dungeons and Dragons. 4th edition probably has quite a selection of books, but I still don't think quite as big as 3.5. And 5th edition only has 3 books right now, I think. It's those core books: the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Monster Manual, and the Player's Handbook. I think that's all there is in 5th edition right now. So, and even if there is a couple more books, it's just not even going to come close to the library of 3.5. And that's one thing I really enjoy, is variety in my game. You can play 3.5 D&D and play a different character you've never heard of every time. And I enjoy that. So that's one reason I want to play it. And the other reason is Pathfinder. Notice I'm talking a lot about Pathfinder and D&D. I kind of use them interchangeably. Pathfinder is a system that is currently still being updated. 3.5 D&D, the support for it has pretty much, died out. There are, I would imagine, still companies producing books for it, but, a lot of the official support has died down. While Pathfinder is a living game, they're making new official books for it all the time. So it can really scratch that itch if you want to be on, do you want the newest, best role-playing system? Pathfinder can fit that need too, and because it's so similar to 3.5, I like the system. It's coming out with new books. It can scratch that itch as well. So with Pathfinder and 3.5, you can really do whatever you want. Whatever you want your role-playing game to do, you can do with it. You want a huge backlog of old books? There you go, 3.5. You want to be on the cutting edge of a new game? Pathfinder. It's all good. So, that's why I chose 3.5 and Pathfinder as my my go-to games. Okay, so now you heard me really briefly mention the books you're going to need. And most role-playing games, just in general, are going to be based on books. They're going to describe you the rule system. In Dungeons and Dragons, and in Pathfinder as well, there are always three core books. And this is true for, I think, all the versions. It may not be true for, 1st edition, and maybe not even for 2nd edition, but certainly for 3rd, 4th, and 5th edition, it's these 3 books that make up the core of the game. And that's going to be the player's handbook. That's the most important. That one is going to give you a little bit of everything, usually. There's usually a couple of monsters in there. There's usually a couple of items. There's definitely hey, what's a sword? What does it do? And there's going to be character classes. That's where you're going to find your barbarian, fighter, wizard, monk, bard. That's where you're going to find those classes described and see what they do. And it's going to take you step by step through how you're going to make a character. So, that's good. That's sort of all you really need. It's going to give you a little bit of everything that you need, and it's going to give you a detailed walkthrough of how to make characters. So that's all you technically need. Then there's the monster manual, which is considered core because it gives you just a huge variety of enemies to face. D&D is very combat oriented. I don't care what other people say. Most of your skills and most of your abilities are going to be about combat. So you're going to spend probably a decent amount of time in combat. Not to say that every game of D&D has to be about combat. No, far from it. The system gives you everything you need to do a role-play encounter. You've got skills like everything from like diplomacy to history. So it gives you everything you need to role-play a game out. It's just that more often than not, D&D games are going to be primarily about combat, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's quite fun. It's a lot of fun. Most abilities that your character is going to have are going to be combat oriented. So Monster Manual gives you a big variety of enemies to fight. Because the game is so combat focused, you want a variety of enemies to fight. It's a good thing. The other book is the Dungeon Master's Guide. The Dungeon Master's Guide is going to provide you with a little detailed information on other systems in the game to flesh out your world, like, say, diseases. Like, how do diseases work in Dungeons and Dragons? Dungeon Master's Guide is going to tell you. I have to fight underwater. Well, how does that work? Dungeon Master Guide is going to tell you. That's what the Dungeon Master's Guide is for. It's for all those questions, for all those scenarios that you think would be really fun but can't really think of like the numbers for. The Dungeon Master Guide helps you with that. It provides a lot of nice rules. And those are the core books. I highly recommend that if you're going to play the game, you definitely need the Player's Handbook. You cannot do without that one. And the Dungeon Master's Guide is going to make just, flesh out your game nicely. And the Monster Manual is going to give you a lot of options for monsters. And this is true for both Pathfinder and 3.5. That's it. What else do you need? That's 3 books I'm having you buy already. What else are you going to need? One thing is you're going to need dice. I know that I personally have bought, I've invested in a lot of dice. You can maybe hear them down here, but, like I've got a couple of handfuls of dice here. I'm not sure I can be able to show you here. But, it's like I've got several dice, and I usually provide dice for my players. Because I have just, a big bag of dice. That all the players can draw from. And dice aren't terribly expensive to get. You can usually get them for and if every player has sort of their own set of dice, then that's fine. But you're going to need pretty much every type of die you're going to be able to find. In Dungeons and Dragons, the 20-sided die is king. In every version of Dungeons and Dragons, you're going to need to roll a 20-sided die to make decisions. If you're doing pretty much anything, you're going to roll a 20-sided die and you're going to add a modifier to it and you're going to check it versus a DC, that is die check. And you're going to try to equal or beat that number. So that is how pretty much every game of Dungeons & Dragons goes. So the 20-sided die is crucial, cannot do without that. And then you're going to need other dice depending on what you're playing, but they're good to have around no matter what, because sometimes you're just going to need them, which is the 12-sided die, favorite of barbarians swinging great axes. You're going to need a 10-sided die. This is what a 10-sided die looks like. It's like a top. 10-sided die, you're going to need a D8. That's an 8-sided die, and you'll see that notation a lot in the books. Is like it'll say like D number 8. It won't say number, but it'll say like D8. And what it's talking about is this. It's an 8-sided die. Well, there that goes. And you're definitely going to need a 6-sided die, a favorite of wizards casting fireball. And then you're going to need a 4th-sided die, which, I'm going to have to dig here for a second to find a 4-sided die. 4-sided die look like this. Yeah. So those are dice that you're going to need to play the game, because pretty much everything in the game is based on those dice. That said, there's lots of alternatives to actually buying dice. This is the 21st century. You can get a dice app for free on your phone that is going to take care of all your rolling needs. And I can also recommend getting, like the dice that I just showed you were pretty much all the dice you're going to need. Occasionally, you're going to need to roll a 3-sided die. It's going to say a D3, and you're going to be like, well, I don't have a D3. That's not something I possess. That usually just means you roll a 6-sided die and divide by half. So if you roll a 1 or a 2, it's a 1. If you roll a 3 or a 4, it's a 2. And if you roll a 5 or a 6, it's a 3. If that makes sense. So it's like it simulates rolling a 3-sided die. But if you're a nerd like me, you will actually go out and buy a 3-sided die. So yeah, this is a 3-sided die. Notice that it can't land on its edge, so it's got to be one of these got to be pointing up. And just because I know that some people are sometimes confused about it, the way a 4-sided die works is that notice that this 3 is on top. At the top of the pyramid, notice that there are 3s all around here. That means if the die lands like this, you have rolled a 3. Handy bit of information. So you're going to need all these dice. That is something you're not going to be able to do without. Another thing that is really handy to have is miniatures. You're going to need something in combat to represent characters. You don't want to have to keep track mentally of where everybody is. Now you can, it's certainly not impossible, and I think some versions of D&D are more friendly to it than others. But having miniatures that represent various people, like you've got like your elven wizard or what have you, and like this dwarven shield maiden. Having miniatures like that, the only thing you need to watch out for is that Dungeons and Dragons has actually thought about how big characters are and how much they take up on a board. You are going to want a 1-inch by 1-inch square board if you're going to be playing with a board. And your minis need to be able to fit into those squares. So you want a mini whose base is, like 1 inch by 1 inch. This is a circle, obviously, but, like an inch diameter. That will do just fine, just so it just fits in there. Then, there are some things that that most minis are going to want to fit that description. Occasionally, you're going to come across, like, really big guys that are, much bigger, and you're going to want them in a dimension of like a 2-inch diameter, 2-inch diameter, so it'll take up 4 squares. That's just something you want to look out for. I'm pretty sure that the vast majority of minis are going to be D&D friendly. They're going to have a 1-inch base. So that is something very useful. And the board I was talking about, I can recommend something like a player's mat like this. See, it's like this nice little material here where you're going to be able to place your miniatures. And this is wet erase, so I can draw with markers on here. Like you can see like the remnants of a map here. Just quickly drawn on there to indicate like walls and things like that. And the miniatures are going to go on that, and they're going to fight and do their thing on the map. And those are all things that make the game run very fluid. That's going to make the game a lot of fun, and it's just good materials to have. That, again, it does not mean that it is necessary to have those. You don't need minis. You could literally use dice or beads or anything you want to represent your characters. They don't have to be miniatures. And miniatures can be quite expensive, so I could see why you might want to skip on that. And as for the map, you could literally take printer paper. I've done that before, where I've printed out a map and made sure that it would print, with those 1-inch by 1-inch squares on it, so that you can play on that. And if you, want a really detailed, nice-looking map, going with printer paper might not be a bad idea. So that's an option. A lot of these things, a lot of D&D players have gotten quite resourceful, so that's nice. All right, but let's take a moment and just talk about the D&D world. That is the world setting, just to make sure that we're on the same page. Because when people hear D&D, they kind of have an idea, like, well, it stands for Dungeons and Dragons, so there's going to be presumably multiple dungeons and multiple dragons, and that's the game. You're going to have elves and dwarves and knights and kings and all that kind of stuff, and that's all true. You do have that in the game, but there are different settings for Dungeons and Dragons, everything from Faerun to all kinds of other different settings that you can have, and there are different parts of the D&D world, and you can make up your own world. I do that more often than not, is that I have my own world that I play in with my own, say, pantheon of gods, or with, my own countries and things like that. And you can just make it up how you want. There's just a couple of core concepts that you probably want to keep the same in every D&D game, unless you really know what you're doing. One of them is that it tends to be a high magic setting. That is, magic is kind of part of the game, which means, because, your characters at level 1 can include wizards and sorcerers and clerics that are all casting spells like crazy. So unless you're prepared to, say, prevent those character classes, there's going to be a lot of magic. Because there are character classes that are just a lot of magic, and they're going to want magic items too. Who doesn't like magic items? And there's a lot of those floating around. So, and a lot of the game kind of assumes that you have them. So that is like the one thing you want to be aware of, is that there's a lot of magic in the game. If you're intending to play something like Lord of the Rings, in Lord of the Rings you have like 7 wizards or something like that. I forget the exact number. But wizards are incredibly special, and every little bit of magic is just very, very special. There aren't characters running around who are, wizards, and they're with a sorcerer friend and a druid pal just, running around. That doesn't really happen in Lord of the Rings. And D&D usually just doesn't work that way, because in your group of people that you're playing with, you're probably going to have like a wizard and a druid and a cleric and a bard's going to be casting magic too. So magic's just everywhere. So that's the first thing about it. The second thing is that certain monsters work in certain ways. So for instance, if there's an undead character, that means something in Dungeons and Dragons, and this is in the rules. I just want to make you aware of it right now. That, like, if there's an undead character, well, the cleric has a spell called, or has an ability called Turn Undead, which is going to make those undead run away. So, you want to be aware of something like that. So, like, if you're encountering undead, that means certain things. There are zombies, and there are skeletons, and there are certain things that means within the D&D world. And it's a very fleshed out world lore-wise. So you want to be aware of that. The other thing is, of course, that it is a medieval setting. There are going to be, there tend to be castles and villages and countryside, nice English countryside kind of thing. And, that's just kind of part of the game. That's sort of the game kind of assumes that that's where you're going to be. But, of course, if you want a more interesting setting to that, or just a different setting to that, that's perfectly possible. I've played in games where, that takes place in space. If you can make space D&D. You can make it happen. Absolutely not a problem. It's just that D&D kind of assumes a medieval fantasy setting. High magic medieval fantasy setting. That's D&D. And beyond that, beyond knowing that it's a very fleshed out world where everything kind of like, if you're encountering demons or undead, and as long as you know what that kind of means, then you're going to be good. You're going to be good to go. You just got to be ready to sort of buy into some of the stuff. Like, there's a difference between demon and devils. Those are two different things, and they work kind of differently. Like, demons, you're not going to be able to talk to. They're chaotic. They're just going to, like, murderize you as soon as they can. While devils, on the other hand, they're going to be pushing that contract on you and be like, all right, here's a little bit of legalese. Sign here on the dotted line. In blood, preferably. Those are going to be devils. So just be aware that pretty much that everything that you're going to want to do has an equivalent of in D&D. If you're going to want to fight devils, there are devils, and that means certain things. So it's a very fleshed out, nice fantasy world. So be aware of that. And beyond that, you can kind of, but everything's tweakable. I'm not going to sit here and be like, no, drow have to be this way. Drow being dark elves, black-skinned, like elves with white hair, white wispy hair. But I'm not going to sit here and be like, drow means this, and they're only that in D&D. Yes, it's true that drow are a favorite bad guy in Dungeons and Dragons. And, but that doesn't mean they always have to be that way. I mean, even do me a favor though, don't play Dritz as a player character. Just it's overdone. But in any case, I'm not going to sit here and say like this can't be done. So keep that in mind. And I think that about tells you everything you need in order to get going in a game of D&D. If you don't know exactly how an RPG works, look at my previous video and I kind of explained a little bit, about sitting around with a table pretending to be elves. What it is about, how it is to play an RPG. But in Dungeons and Dragons, I think I've told you a little bit about what materials you're going to need. I'm gonna, what you should be expecting, what the different versions are. So hopefully that has been helpful, and hopefully, you're now sitting here thinking like, yeah, I'm gonna play some maybe 5th edition D&D because I want to be on the cutting edge of D&D, or maybe some Pathfinder or 3.5 D&D as I'm a fan of. So yeah, in my next videos, I'm going to be going over the nitty-gritty. No more general talky about making a character. No, we are going to make a character. And I think what I'm going to do is, because Pathfinder is a living game that is currently, being made, I think I'm going to focus on make a Pathfinder character for you guys first, and then if the demand is there, I'm going to make a 3.5 character as well. But I'll be pointing out, where maybe some of the differences are between Pathfinder and 3.5. And to be perfectly honest, if you can make a Pathfinder character, you can make a 3.5 character. They're not that different. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something too about Dungeons and Dragons. And what I hope above all is that, you're ready to jump into a game and want to jump into a game. Alright, so thanks for listening, guys, and I'll see you next time.